Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. My name's Stuart Kelly. I'm a writer and critic, and it's a real pleasure to be here to chair this event with Malachy Tallack and Kathleen Winter. Their books are very much kindred spirits. Malachy's book is 60 Degrees North, Around the World in Search of Home, charting his journey round the 60th parallel, and Kathleen's is Boundless, tracing land and dream in a new Northwest Passage. They're both going to read just to give you a flavour of the books, then I'll start a conversation with them and you'll join in with that conversation. Please welcome the authors. Kathleen, do you want to read first?
If you like.
Great.
I tore this out of the book so I wouldn't have to carry it on the plane. It's not every day a place retains the potency it had when it represented a dream or a wish. In front of me now stood mountains that something nameless had imagined out of crumpled light and the glow of sapphires. Namelessness had breathed substance into the light, the way it had breathed breath into man, as if human bodies and the body of this land were negative versions of each other, man a breath-containing substance, the north a substance-imbued breath. The colors burned cold and intense, that turquoise Arctic water, the snow, ice, purple mountains. I felt the complete presence of a terrain that knows an absence of the markers that signify business as usual in the south. Light did not contain itself within southern boundaries, but sank into the water and the land and made them glow. Light pulsed in and out of rock, ice, and water, illumining strange crevices. We were on the deck now, coming into Pond Inlet, and I was glad of Elizabeth's restraint, because I wouldn't have wanted either of us to speak as the ship entered this world of effervescent newness. Turquoise water, purple and gold mountains, white mist. It was like being inside a wish, and was, in fact, that very thing, for wasn't the entrance to the Northwest Passage the essence of what my father and Englishmen before him had wished, gazing from cramped Britain towards sapphires and silk roads and what they called the Orient? And I had, somehow, yearning to follow my own filament of something elusive and glimmering, oriented myself into the center of the wish. Here were myself and Elizabeth, alone on the deck of a ship, immersed in it. I think I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. Malachy, want to?
Okay. So this is a book really about engagement with place and the attempt to engage with places, but I'm going to read a piece about my failure to engage well with one of the places that I visited, and that was in Alaska. And that failure manifested itself as fear. As I took those first steps on the trail and into the forest, the fear rose quickly in my throat. Moving between thick, new-growth trees with visibility down almost to zero, I could feel my heart beat harder. My fear was complicated and confusing, but as I walked, the thump in my chest found its focus in one simple word: bear. With fishing rod, tackle bag, and waders in my hand, I felt clumsy and vulnerable, and I stopped almost immediately to rearrange my luggage. The pair of waders were flung over my shoulder together with the bag. In one hand, I held the fishing rod, and in the other, I gripped my fingers around a canister of bear spray just inside my jacket pocket. I checked that I could remove it easily and quickly. I set my index finger inside the looped safety catch. I focused my eyes and ears on the forest. Pepper spray is pretty much the last resort when faced with a brown bear. Ineffective at a distance of more than a few meters, it's useful only when you're being charged. And if you're being charged by an animal that can be more than 8 feet tall when standing, 600 kilos in weight, and which can run as fast as a horse, it's important that the spray is successful. If it's not, your only possible chance of escape is to play dead and hope the bear loses interest. If you're lucky, it might paw you for a moment, perhaps breaking your limbs in the process. If you're not lucky, you won't have to pretend to be dead very long. The best way to avoid such an attack, I was told, other than to remain indoors at all times, is to be noisy. Bears become angry when they're surprised or threatened, and as a rule they'll stay away from people given the opportunity. Many hikers wear a bell to alert animals to their approach. Others simply shout or sing as they go. Somehow it feels odd to confront your fears in this way, to let the danger know you're coming. I wanted to sneak through the trees unnoticed as well as unscathed, but I followed the advice I'd been given and I tried to sing. As the trail rose into old-growth forest and the sound of the highway was lost behind me, I could feel the presence of the bear like a ghost among the trees. The space was haunted by it, as was I. Beneath the canopy of leaves, a whole array of spirits seemed to dwell. Invisible insects clouded my face, and birds moved unseen above. Even the trees themselves were somehow not unmoved by my steps. The singing didn't last for long. Somehow no words felt right, and the sound of my voice was alien and intrusive. My mouth became dry and useless, and I took instead to humming both random tunes and familiar melodies, some of them ludicrously out of place, and yet still strangely comforting. I imagined myself from the outside, a man alone, walking fearfully through an Alaskan forest laden with fishing tackle, humming Mr. Tambourine Man as loudly as he could manage. Surely a bear would be more likely to laugh than to attack. After 10 minutes or so of hiking, something made me pause and turn my head. I stood still and listened. My breath was loud and my heart thumping, but another sound too broke the forest's silence. A rhythmic pounding like feet or paws running in my direction. I turned to where the noise came from and looked out among the trees. It can have been a few seconds only between hearing the animal and seeing it coming towards me, but in that brief time I had imagined in detail what was to come. The beat of my pulse had fallen in time with the thud of the 4 approaching feet. The spray had been lifted from my pocket and gripped tightly around the top. I had steadied myself in anticipation and in regret, and then there it was.
In both your books, these Hyperborean journeys mean renegotiating what you think about land and space. Towards the end of your book, you have the revelation that all land is sacred, and Malachy, in your book, you see the different ways in which different indigenous peoples of the North have a different relationship to the land. Can you talk a bit about what you learned about these different approaches to land? Kathleen.
When I went north, I had no idea what the land was going to say, and I had no idea what it was going to mean to me at the end of the journey. So I thought it was inert, but I came to see it as living, as very much living and even sentient. So it was the land that spoke to me so powerfully that made me write the book in the first place. I had not intended to write a book.
You hadn't intended to write it at all. I mean, it was
No.
that profound relationship. That idea of the sacredness of it, can you just expand a bit upon that?
Usually people don't want to hear anything about that at all, so thank you for asking.
No.
No, I mean, the letters that come from, the emails that come from the agent and the editor are, are you sure you want to be woo-woo? And I don't want to be that way. I'm really quite an analytical person, and I'm not as lyrical as it might seem. So it was in fact an experience, a felt experience, where I was alone on the land. We got to walk big distances and be alone on that ground. And the only way I can describe it is that it wordlessly spoke to me as if it had spoken words. And it said 4 words to me, which I put in the book and which I was asked to take out, but I couldn't take them out because without those words there would have been no book. And the words were, there is no other. So it was about the illusion of separation.
It's an astonishing epiphany in the book, and the fact that I presume your editors and agents are living in cities, but they would have a slightly different relationship to the nature of the land. Malachy, right the way through your book, you're meeting people who are reformers, looking at land reform, looking at different concepts of ownership. Can you talk a bit about what you learned on that journey?
I was actually going to follow up on this idea of the spiritual relationship to the land, because I met people in Greenland and in Canada particularly, their relationship to the land would very much be defined in those terms. And looking from the outside, spirituality can be a difficult thing to get grips on. And I suppose what I felt, first of all, was the absence of that relationship within the culture that I had come from. Mm-hmm. We really have no relationship with the land. It's just a thing that we live on and use and try to make money out of. And for people like the First Nations in Canada and the Inuit in Greenland, it's a relationship in very much the same way that people have relationships with each other. I think they see it as reciprocal, and as I say, that from the outside that's quite difficult to get a hold of. But I think beginning to do that is about being open to it, I think, and like what you said about going out there on your own and listening to what it says to you and trying to learn something from a particular place. That's the first step, I suppose.
You mentioned there about the fact that the relationship we have to the land is one of possession and exploitation. And it does seem that in both books there's a very major concern that these places are already irredeemably affected by human agency, and not just in terms of the First Nations people. Can you talk a bit about what is being lost there?
When I went through what we call the Northwest Passage, I expected there to be a lot of places where there were no people. The very first thing we saw in Pond Inlet, or Meteorite Tallack is the Inuit name for it, was the Canadian military. The former defense minister for the federal government was crawling and stalking around on the beach in full camouflage gear with a bunch of his, members of the army. So another thing that happened was we were grounded, and we had to be rescued by what we thought were members of the Coast Guard, but really the Coast Guard ship had been overtaken by geologists who were mapping that part of the Arctic Ocean floor for British Petroleum and consortia of business and governments over the world. So wherever we went, there was evidence that money interests and military and corporate interests were not figuratively but present and literally poised to make the next grab to increase the bottom line, and that was a big surprise to me.
I had a similar experience in Greenland, in that I was very aware. I met numerous people who were there from mining companies and so on, and in Greenland it's a big issue. There's a lot of mining going on, particularly rare earth mining, the kind of minerals that go into mobile phones and so on, but they're also there's pressure being put on them to open it up to mining uranium, I think. And you can see the difficulty for places like this, because for somewhere like Greenland, trying to run an economy in the modern world is so difficult, and any source of money is a huge temptation. And it's very hard trying to see the balance. We want to tell them, leave things as they are, but they have to live.
They say we want
people
to
have to live.
Shoes and mobile phones and
Yes.
computers. It's very interesting because I read one report that one of the long-term sort of future analyses about potential flashpoints, potential future zones of conflict, that the Arctic is one of them, that the vested interests of Russia, America, Canada, Scandinavian countries are all trying to stake their claim on the waters there because of the possibility of mining. So it seems that there's something very peculiar. You think of this as a place, sort of Ultima Thule, the ends of the earth, beyond politics, and you find it's actually at the heart of politics.
Well, you only have to turn the map on its head and see a circumpolar map to see the potential problems when you see all of these countries and how close they actually are from looking at.
And really, I think that juxtaposing of myth, story, yearning, and the Great White North with actual political searching for oil, minerals, territory, they have always been like superimposed stories, so that we believe that we're looking at a romantic story when in fact we're looking at a political one. It's a bit like religion, isn't it?
Absolutely. In terms of the people there, obviously there's an idea of wilderness as being the unpeopled, but there are people who are there, not just from the First Nations community, but other ones. What did you learn from the First Nations people? I mean, you were travelling with two of them who...
There were two Inuit women on board our ship. One was a dual citizen Canadian and Greenlandic Inuit woman called Ayu Peter, and the other was a Canadian Inuit woman called Bernadette Dean. And Bernadette had an ongoing subversive commentary that I really enjoyed, you know, because our own position as interlopers walking on the land was quite ambiguous to her. And at one point she looked at everybody going over the ridge with the binoculars and the cameras and the bright anoraks, and she said, "They look just like Franklin's men." And so there is, even in being a person who's going in the north now, to learn about it and to observe and to find things out, there's an ambiguity and a difficulty. There's a ship going through there this summer, I believe, that has a casino on it.
Unbelievable. Malachy, what?
Yeah, there's a real sense when you speak to people in the north, who are from the north, they have a sense of fear, I think, and about what's coming towards them almost from the outside, this kind of encroachment of the world. And the fear is well-founded, and it's difficult. One of the very interesting things in Greenland, I was speaking to people, and this is something I wrote about in the book, is about how you deal with some of these problems that you have within native communities there, that you have within native communities in other places too, so alcoholism and drug abuse and these kind of things. And I was speaking to a social worker there, and she was saying, it has to be education. This is how we get young people out of this. But the problem with that, of course, is that education takes people away from the land. If you're in a remote town in Greenland, you want to go to a high school, you have to go to a town that's 100 miles up the coast. If you want to go to college, you have to go to Nuuk. If you want to go to university, you have to go to Copenhagen. And it's not just physically taking you away. The things you are learning in these places make it more and more difficult for you to go back to these places. And so education, which ought to be an answer, is actually a very complicated answer.
It's strange that as well, given that the Inuit are the only humans on the planet who, before contact with Western capitalism, had no recourse to any kind of psychotropic drugs or alcohol. You can't make alcohol, there's no kind of fly agaric or fungi that grow there, there's no coca leaves. You know, this was humanity without its boundless addictions. One of my favourite books about the North is Sick Heart River by John Buchan, the Scottish writer. And in Sick Heart River, he goes to the north to be healed, Sir Edward Leithen, the character. Both your books have quite an elegiac undertow. Did you find that these journeys into the north were a healing journey, Kathleen?
It was transformative, there's no doubt about that. For me, it transformed how I see land and how I see the planet. And in a way, it was the beginning of a healing process that for me is about rootedness and belonging, homecoming and pilgrimage. Because my father moved us away from the north of England when I was 8, and we lived in Newfoundland. And he had a very different life. He built a log cabin and became self-sufficient in vegetables and hunted. Most of the meat we ate was hunted. But the strange thing was that all of my Newfoundland friends on our street, if you opened their fridge, they'd have Kraft plastic cheese slices and white sliced bread. My family had this. It was like my dad moved back in time, not just place, a couple of 100 years, and we became this strange pioneer family that didn't belong there. So for me going to the north, it was the first time since I'd been a child where I stood on land that for some reason allowed me to belong. And I.U. Peter told me that it's because in the north there is no rejection of people. The land and the Inuit people are, they are, I won't say welcoming, but they are accepting of a person's right to belong because you're human. So this was a kind of...
But it's also a thing about reliance, isn't it? That it's strange that your father's sort of Hawthorne-esque pioneering spirit, but one thing that comes out very strongly in your book is that you do not have the option of not being a community in the north. You can't cut yourself off from everyone else. This idea, I mean, it's a very romantic idea, sort of Caspar David Friedrich idea of the solitary figure in the north, but what comes across from your book is you can't do that. You have to have a relationship with other people.
That's been quite interesting, actually, reading reviews of my book. There's quite a lot of emphasis on solitariness. And for me, exactly what you said, the north, you can't be solitary for long in the north, otherwise you're going to die. Communities are essential. But going back to what you were speaking about a moment ago, it was very interesting to read Kathleen's book, because we had this quite similar experience when we were young, and that we were both removed from one home and put in another. We were forced to come to terms with it. And in terms of the talking about healing, I think that writing this book helped me a great deal in terms coming to terms with some of those things that took a very long time to deal with, that change from the south of England to Shetland, and the sense of not belonging somewhere that came from that.
It's a nice sort of pun that these books are about longing and belonging, that in each case it's about desire and desire to come back. I mean, do you feel more rooted to place now, having been to all these different parts around the 60th?
It feels odd to say so, having now left Shetland and living in Glasgow. But I think what I would say is that my relationship to Shetland is much simpler than it used to be. I see Shetland as home, and almost that's the end of the story. Shetland is home, I live in Glasgow. That's as simple as it can get. I don't have nearly so much of a mixed feeling when I'm there as I used to.
There's a kind of paradox as well about voyaging in the north, in that, I mean, both of you express very clear environmental and ecological concerns, and yet most of the transport in the north will be with fossil-fueled helicopters, sleds, the very things which are increasing the likelihood that this will vanish. How do you square that paradox? Doesn't look like anyone wants this question.
Well, I mean, I alluded to it before. You go there, but you're part of the influx. The only thing I can say is that, I mean, I'm an observant but subjective writer, so I just feel that it is a gift to have been able to stand in that land and to not just to see it, but to hear it. And I noticed in your book, I don't know how you feel about this, but every place you went had a sound. I mean, a real sound, the sound of the breeze in the trees, or the sound of the river, or white noise of the wind. And I really connected with that, and I wanted to ask you about it. Are you aware that there are sounds all the way through your book?
The sky was full of noises.
I wasn't aware of that, no.
Is sound something that you are attuned to all the time?
I suppose so. And I mean,
you are a singer-songwriter, so there's...
Well, we're both musicians, singers, so that's interesting that it would be there, and that you noticed.
There wasn't one place you wrote about that did not have a sound, a really important sound.
That's good. I suppose it is something that I notice, and perhaps that does come through then, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Just specifically, Kathleen, one thing which I found very remarkable about your book is when you're working with these geologists, finding a poetry in what can seem a very scientific, dry language. What was that process like about finding the poetry within the geology?
Well, at first, I avoided the geologists like the plague because they're so enthusiastic, but they think in geological time. So to them, you know, rock is active, it's doing something. The fact that it takes 50 trillion years to do it is immaterial to them. They get as excited as if it was banging and crashing right before our very eyes. And I found this so uninteresting. I would run away and I'd tell them, I'm interested in things whose movement I can see with the naked eye. And so they were also patient and funny, and also they knew. They had a deep confidence in the importance of their own work. So they'd say to me very quietly, Kathleen, that polar bear you're so interested in relies on the geology, because if the minerals of the rocks did not feed the flora that feeds the bear, there would be no bear. And ultimately, we got grounded on a piece of uncharted rock. And when I asked the geologist, do you know what kind of rock that is? He replied, without skipping a beat, oh yes, it's a piece of gabrous sill, and proceeded to tell me its whole geological history, as if we weren't at a list and waiting for the Coast Guard and perhaps sinking and our lives in peril. He just calmly told me about the geology of this rock. So that when I came home, I had a new respect for the bedrock of everything, all that we are, including lyricism, poetry, and song that I had not known before. And there's a part in the book where Bernadette Dean tells me about the meteorite in Greenland,
yes,
which it was taken by Peary. He had to build a little bit of railway to get to the boat and bring it to New York City, where it rests now in the Museum of Natural History. But there are gouges taken out of it. And you mentioned this in your book too. There's quite a few things that are in both books. The tools, the iron tools that are taken out of the meteor, you can still see the indentations. And it's, for me, a very moving thing, this stolen meteorite that used to be very much a part of the livelihood of generations of indigenous people.
Should it be repatriated?
Well, the question as to, you know, should it be repatriated, I'm wary of pat answers, but another thing that was taken was the garments of the grandmother. She'd made them, like Bernadette Dean's grandmother had made these garments, beaded them, and a whaling captain from Boston had taken them, and they're with the meteorite in the same museum, and I went to visit it. And they wouldn't let her go and touch her own grandmother's things without her practically having to beg and wear special gloves and have a 2-week window where it was the only time she was allowed to see them. It made me wonder, you know, what would I feel like if my grandmother's handmade clothing was inaccessible to me and had been stolen by a museum in a different country? Anyway, that's all about rock, ultimately. Really it is.
Malachy, when you're travelling around in the different places, quite often what you're interested in is not just the sort of the geology and the flora and fauna and the people there, but the cultures that have developed there. There's sections on Elias Lönnrot's Kalevala poem, on Pushkin. Can you talk a bit about how you weave the culture through the natural description?
I think that what I was trying to do, in a sense, was quite similar. It was to show that these things are not disconnected, that the natural landscapes of a place, the flora and fauna of a place are entirely connected to the kind of cultures that spring up there. And while we now tend to see them differently, within the book I was trying to push them back together and show where the connections were, show where the links come.
I mean, things like the Kalevala, it's astonishing that this poem, which was put together from fragments of poetry that maybe from the 13th century, 12th century, even earlier, becomes the kind of rallying call for the Finns' independence. Strikingly different for Scotland, where we collected all our ballads, and Walter Scott did, and it sort of secured us firmly in the Union. The ways in which the culture does actually encode national identities seems to be quite important in your book.
Possibly. You're leading me. The Finnish example is very interesting, and I think it's that story is the way it is because you had dual cultures in Finland. You had Finnish culture, which was rural and poor, and you had Swedish culture, which was urban and wealthy, and they were very, very separate. And so those poems became hugely important because they belonged to people, and it's far more mixed up. Scotland is far more mixed up than that.
Scotland being mixed up is, I think, a fairly uncontentious proposition. Although, one thing that I was very interested, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the Scandinavian models. When you were comparing Shetland with some of these parts, the Swedish part within Finland,
well, the comparison was with Åland, the Åland Islands.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, can you just explain to the audience the kind of culture that Åland has?
Well, Åland is very odd because it's sort of halfway between Sweden and Finland, and it's culturally Swedish, and it's sort of moved around between different owners for a long time, and then after the First World War, they wanted to go back to Sweden, and Finland said no, and the League of Nations had this kind of what could have been a complete botched job where they assigned it to Finland but made it culturally Swedish, enshrined in law, and the Finnish army are not allowed to go to Åland. So they have this really weird situation, and it could have been a complete disaster, but somehow it worked, and somehow they've grown to really like this oddness. And Åland is often mentioned as a potential model for Shetland because every so often you get these talks about Shetland autonomy and so on. And it's interesting to think about, but Åland is not a very realistic example for Shetland because Åland is situated geographically conveniently between two very wealthy countries. And a big part of its economy today relies on these huge cruise ships that go back and forth selling cheap alcohol. So their economy is slightly artificial, I would say. But it's very interesting from a Shetland perspective to look at places like that, and Faroe, of course, that do have
the fact that they
autonomy.
have, you know, so many public radio stations. And
it's incredible.
And,
yeah,
I mean, that seems
28,000 people in Åland, and they have 2 daily newspapers and 2 radio stations, and incredible interest in themselves. But
I think I'd like to open it up to the floor. Can we have the house lights up? Who'd like to kick off with the first question to either Kathleen or to Malachy? There's always the... Well, we can keep chatting quite happily. So, the Siberian side of things. Can you tell me a bit about the experience in Siberia?
Siberia was, in some ways, a difficult one to write about because the journey I made to Kamchatka, which is actually officially not part of Siberia, it's beyond Siberia, was not done as part of the book. I went there when I was 21, 22. And it was the first time that I had been to a place and felt this incredible emotional connection to it, which at the time to me was inexplicable. And I still don't understand exactly what it was about Kamchatka, but I came away from it and it felt like I was in love. It was that was exactly the feeling. I had this longing for this place that I had been for just 2 weeks. And I still feel it, actually. I've never been back, and I still have this longing for this place that was wild and strange and incredibly beautiful. And in some ways, that was one of these things that started me thinking about these questions. What are the things that connect you to a place? What makes you connect or click with a place?
One of the things I really liked about your book was how you weren't afraid to insert subjective, impressionistic, and emotional observations that were more than the sum of their parts, that indicated a larger whole. And I think a lot of writers are afraid to do that, and I really found that the book touched me the way it did because you weren't afraid to do that. Can you talk about that at all?
I think, particularly in travel writing, there's a kind of tradition of pretending that you're objective, and looking at places and talking about places as if you are an objective observer. And I couldn't pretend that. I mean, the story that I tell about my own past is not the focus of this book, and it wasn't what I set out to write about. But I felt that it needed to be there in the end as a kind of, to be honest and say, look, this is the journey I made and this is the baggage that I took with me.
Well, this happened to me as well, because when I first decided I want to somehow convey the message of the North to people, I thought, well, there were small marine mammal biologists, large marine mammal biologists. There was more experts than I'd ever met before on that ship, and I thought, well, I took notes and I learned, what they had to tell us. And it was dead. The script was dead when I tried to write, the things that they had taught me. It didn't convey what had happened at all, and it was only when I allowed myself to be present in the narrative that the land spoke. Because even though I still think I am on that ship probably the person with the least authority to write a book about the journey, I was there, and it had a huge effect on how I see the planet and how I see myself and how I see my country and the whole of the North and what it has to teach the rest of us, that I just said to hell with it. I'll do the best I can.
There's a thing in your book as well, though, about, just when Malachy was mentioning baggage, about lightness, about wanting to have your friend who has the one bag that you can just go off with. Was there a desire to sort of be less material, to be less connected to possession?
I had, shortly before the voyage, got rid of a house and the contents of, bringing up 2 daughters and a husband who had died and left behind all these precious objects that basically had to be burned on a raft on the surface of the ocean.
Description of this Viking
You know, there's things, you reach a point in your life where you don't want to accumulate. You do need to see what remains when you get rid of all the stuff. So, yeah, that had begun to happen with me.
I think there was a question just here. If we come to this lady here first.
I'm just sitting here, somebody who has just organised a Nordic art exhibition. I'm a journalist, I know nothing about art, and it's exactly as you describe. You know, having gone there, I'm thinking, this needs to be shared with other people. And strangely, one of the exhibits is from the Åland Islands, so there's so much in common there. What I wanted to ask was, you talked a lot and very movingly about your journeys and about being there for brief periods of time. But was there anywhere you went where you thought you wanted to live?
Excellent question.
For me, it was more a question of, was there anywhere I went where I wanted to do more than just pass through? And I would like to go for a season or a year, and which you've already done, but be part of the rhythm of a community, be somebody who has to cook a meal, who has to eat meat that's been hunted and perhaps find it myself. I do have a wish to do that, and again it's linked to the wish to stay in one place and see what belonging there has to teach. I passed through, and the place taught me so much. What would happen if I stayed a while?
And the culinary parts of your book are absolutely tremendous.
I suppose that the place that I felt that most of all was the one that reminded me of home most of all, which was Fort Smith in Canada. It was a community that I expected to be alien because it's in the middle of the continent, in the middle of the forest. And yet, for those very reasons, because it's isolated, it's an island community. And so it was extremely familiar. I felt, as soon as I got there, I could see how the community worked. It was very similar to Shetland in a lot of ways. And I enjoyed the time I spent there and was sorry to be leaving. And it certainly was a place that I felt I could have gone and lived for longer, yeah.
There is something about Fort Smith, because I've just been to Yellowknife, and the people who were in Yellowknife, it was for a book festival in Yellowknife, the people from Fort Smith, the minute, and this was before I had read your book, the minute any of them told me anything about home, Fort Smith, I thought, I have to go there. There's something about that place.
Maybe it is that particular community then. It's certainly an incredible place, and it's not somewhere that many tourists end up.
No.
So when you go there, people want to speak to you, they ask you what you're doing, and it's a very open community.
Come to this.
Yes, I haven't read either of the books yet, with the emphasis on yet, of course. But you asked Malachy right at the beginning in the questioning about land ownership. And I was wondering with both of you, I mean, you've taken in a broad sweep of countries with different relationships with land ownership and use of the land. And I wondered how that relates to your, to what you're saying about the culture.
Well, my dad left the north of England thinking he was going to a place where you could own land and where he could have a closer relationship with land. And I told him, I'm going to Scotland with Esther. We're each going to take a one-man tent. And you can, I believe, as long as you don't, do obnoxious things, you have freedom to camp. If you do that in North America, you're going to get somebody chase you off their land with a shotgun. So it's really a surprising thing. I think people think of the so-called New World as a place of freedom to roam, when in fact that does not exist, and people's relationship with land becomes proprietorial to a dangerous extent.
The big division in terms of land ownership is between the Western culture and the native cultures. The vast majority of whom simply fail to understand what it means to own land. It just doesn't make sense to own a piece of land. It's the same way that we would think about owning air. It's just difficult to comprehend. And Greenland is really the only place where that is still in evidence, in the sense that in Greenland you can't own land. The state owns all of the land. And so you just rent bits of it for your own home, but the land is owned in terms of its usage. The people who use the land it belongs to them, and they belong to it. But Alaska also has a very odd situation that I speak about in the book, and they had I can't remember what it's called now, the native, I can't remember, in the 70s, essentially they parceled up bits of Alaska and just gave it to native people there, as sort of saying, sorry for stealing your country, you can have these. And some of these they call them corporations, native corporations, they actually have a huge amount of money because the land is worth quite a lot. But it's a sort of odd, quite American fudge that they've ended up with there.
I also haven't read either of the books yet, but I think I haven't heard mentioned, and maybe you don't write about it, was in my mind before I ever came, as one of the things that you could be saying or noticing. I've heard about rock and about the land, obviously sounds. What about light? Because my thought was that north in Scotland, in the north of Scotland, the quality of light in Iceland, the quality of light is so different even from the quality of light here, let alone further south. I wondered if either of you talk about that, or if that was important or not.
Light was hugely important to my perception of the North. When we got to the place of perpetual luminescence, I felt as if the North was holding illumination and light and enlightenment for other parts of the world. I felt that very strongly.
Malachy.
Light's interesting because, I mean, I was following what is, in essence, an arbitrary line around the world. But the one thing that does hold places together along the 60th parallel is the fact that day length is exactly the same wherever you go. And the light is very similar, it's very familiar. I was speaking to somebody earlier from Shetland who said the same thing. She visited Alaska and the light felt familiar. And that's possibly something I didn't write about enough in the book, now that I think about it, because it's very hard to write about light and what it is about it that is familiar. But certainly in some of these places, that was a strong sense that I had, yeah.
There's another one just there.
I am that person from Shetland. At least I grew up there, and I relate very much to a lot of what has been said, particularly the question of the light. I felt that I had, when I went to Alaska, that I had been there before. I must have been born here some other time. But in fact, of course, it was this wonderful feeling of the light that was just the same as in Shetland. The other point that I felt very much I identified with was this concept of home. I've lived out of Shetland for over 60 years in various parts of Britain, and even for a short period of time in Poland. And I always think of home as Shetland, and particularly Lerwick, where I grew up, but it's something about the place and the places that I visited when I lived there and where I holidayed there that I go back to when I'm stressed, and I go back to in my dreams, and I better be quiet about that, but it is just, I'm still a Shetlander. Although I was born there and my parents weren't, but I am rooted there, and I don't think I'll ever lose that root. And it's a very important root because it was something about the way that people accepted you there. My father went there in the 1920s post-First World War, an injured young man to take up a small business, and he was taken into the body of the community and loved, and he never left, and he developed the business, and my brothers and I were born there, and it was the sense of community that I felt very strongly, that I took away with me, and that I see in other places. And I think that's a very important point that was made.
Is that sense of the northern community that way? I mean, I'm a borderer, have always been a borderer, and you know, famously we say that you're not really a borderer until you can point to 3 generations of graves in the kirkyard, and even then you're a bit of an incomer. You know, is there something more open in these northern communities like that?
I have found people in Labrador in particular have been extremely welcoming. I make things with my hands when I'm not writing. I spin wool with a hand spindle, and so I make wool, and I make one-of-a-kind things out of that wool with a crochet hook. So the minute you go to one of those communities and you start making something with your hands, you do belong, because that is universal, and it's universally respected. And I give things to people, and they have bequeathed things to me. So one of the ways of belonging to me has been in the north through wool.
When you find these particularly open communities like Fort Smith, it can be a very powerful thing. And the place that is at the heart of this book for me, really, and on the cover, is Fair Isle, which was where I started writing the book. And I think that I probably began writing it there because it was the first place where I had felt truly at home. I had a really strong sense of attachment and a settled feeling of attachment.
You started knitting, right? Isn't that in the book?
I did knit when I was in Fair Isle.
That was your first job.
Yeah. This is not one of mine, though.
It's all about wool.
Can we come to this gentleman here?
I want to see if you could say something about there's a melting of the polar ice cap, and with it, oil exploration in the Arctic Circle, and the threat to the entire region as a result of the oil drilling and the competing interests now over oil drilling.
Well, there's no doubt about the oil interests that are there as we speak, poised, examining, and doing everything they can to exploit that resource. And I have friends who have chosen not to have children because we refuse to learn as a species. It's a question, are we going to do anything or not? We need a paradigm shift. We need a complete change in the way we think. This will take time. My husband is very fond of saying, don't worry, the planet will take care of itself once it gets rid of us.
Does Antarctica offer a solution for the Arctic problems? Being designated as a site of special scientific interest and the very stringent rules that deal with the landscape there?
It won't happen in the Arctic.
I think this will have to be the last question, so quite succinctly.
I hope this doesn't come across as negative, but I've lived overseas in different countries for more than 20 years. I've lived in the UK for 16 years, Southern England, Northern England, now here in Edinburgh, which I love. But I find the climate very difficult at times, and the lack of light, and the sky feels lower. I don't know if I'm alone, but I know my husband feels likewise. But anyway, did that ever, the lack of light, did that ever, and my husband actually was in Finland for a number of years and said that the lack of light does affect people. Did you experience any of that?
Not for me, because I was going from Shetland, so everywhere I went was the same as it would have been were I at home. So there was no change really in terms of the light for me.
But one of the writers who you quote, and I do as well in my book, is the American writer Gretel Ehrlich, who wrote a book, I think it's called 7 Seasons in Greenland, and she stayed through the darkness, and she writes of vast psychological changes that happen because of the lack of light. She is of a temperament that was more interested and curious and challenged by that than oppressed. But it depends on who you are.
Indeed, the depression used to be referred to as the Orcadian disease and put down solely to the fact that there was these points, not just of total luminescence, but of total darkness. I'm afraid we're out of time, and if you did have other questions, do come over to the main bookshop where Malachy and Kathleen are going to be signing. I can't commend the books highly enough to you. They're absolutely astonishing and unforgettable, and I, for one, feel that I've been there and don't need to increase my carbon footprint by actually seeing it. Please thank both the authors.